Next up is Analia Porrás, who is with PAHO and is going to be talking about institutional development and financing. And she is the unit chief for medicines and health technologies, health systems and services. So welcome, Analia.
Thank you, and congratulations on your Spanish rolling R's. Not anyone. So, no, good afternoon, everybody. To the ones, there are many people in the room that are going to be familiar with what we do. For the other ones, I'm going to rush through a little bit of the background. As Mike mentions, we've been doing a lot of this work in the region for many years. And what Jillian asked me to concentrate today is in a particular aspect, is in the management, the IDP, and the financing. So it's a challenge because we have a lot of data, but we haven't put together a presentation on this, so we were working on it. But before I begin, besides thanking the committee and particularly Jillian, I have to say that I was involved in the previous one very briefly, and part of the team PAHO was. And one thing that I'm not sure other institutions, but for us, the previous iteration of this report was seminal to advancing a lot of the thinking and work that we did in the region. And I was appalled when she told me it was 2012. That means I'm really getting old very fast, but it looks like it was yesterday. So it was time to update it. So what did we do? Let me give you a very brief timeline of what was happening in PAHO, because PAHO has kind of a separate track on how this work developed over the years. Since 1998, we have PANDRA, which is a regulatory authorities network that conglomerates from Canada to Argentina, every single country in the region, as a network. And we work through PANDRA to improve harmonization and do guidelines. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit how we come to realize that it wasn't not always the most effective work, although PANDRA has contributed greatly to the work of regulatory system strengthening in the region. But part of the regulations in 2006 got together in Oaxaca. It's called the Oaxaca Group, and as PAHO says, we really need to benchmark ourselves because we want to harmonize, we want to share information, but we really don't have any element to know what is the other one doing and how well the other one is doing. So trust, a central element of regulatory system strengthening and harmonization, wasn't there. So PAHO came in as a honest broker to actually kind of see how can we help these regulated come together. Inspiring in the 1997 tool that Mike mentions that was used for vaccine pre-qualification. It wasn't for regulatory systems strengthening at that time. PAHO took that tool and developed a regulatory system strengthening capacity tool, which evolved over the year. We were really shaky at the beginning, but the concept was a standardized tool used in different countries to assess functionality, but important concept was that it was done by peers. So PAHO wasn't the one doing the assessment. We were coordinating the assessment. The assessment was done by regulators from other regulatory authorities. And the process was transparent. It was confidential during the process, but then the results will be shared among regulators who will participate in the process, which was a voluntary process. This led to change of paradigm in the region from a reputational-based system to an objective assessment of regulatory capacity, and it came together in 2010 with a resolution of the Directed Council of PAHO, which all member states approved unanimously, called Strengthening of the RNAs of Drugs and Products of Biological CD50R9. And today, many years later, we have 28 regulatory authorities that had been, and systems that had been assessed. And actually, this assessment, as Mike mentioned in the previous presentation, has developed into naming at least today 8 regulatory authorities of reference, which we use as a trust mechanism. It's a band of honor, but also we use to procure products that are not pre-qualified for our member state till 2013. And for example, today, many of the countries can procure immunosuppressors for transplant patients 10 times lower price that they will do at the local market, because we have a bidding, an international bidding, and the only requirement is that to apply, not to then we evaluate the product, to actually be registered in one of those regulatory authorities of reference. So we have actually gone not only on the regulatory side, but also on the access side to products that are not usually in the portfolio of the WHO pre-qualification. We would still consider the gold standard for our procurement for vaccines on, for example, antiretroviral. So a little bit more on that. So as I told you, we were many years concentrating on PANDRA, developing guidelines. We weren't that great at that. I mean, let's face it, we always came later than ICH. Some of the guidelines were difficult to implement. But when we got a guideline, which was very good, because it took a lot of work, then we look at how well countries were adopting those guidelines. And if you look, the blue is the good news, and the orange and the gray is not the really good news. And many of our guidelines were not doing very well at adoption. So we were putting a lot of effort, a lot of money, and those guidelines weren't adopted. And if you look at why we're not adopted fully, mostly was because the structure, the capacity, the competencies to absorb that was not put in place. And although we think there's still a place for that, and we actually work now, PANDRA has been revitalized and more work on project and collaboration, we kind of shifted the approach using the benchmarking tool to facilitate development on context-specific national regulatory system. Not everybody deserves or needs an FDA, because the health system and the manufacturing place doesn't actually call for one. You need to promote regulatory convergence and harmonization when appropriate, also reliance, and the fact that all those NRAs of reference are of reference have shifted reliance into speed mode. Actually, a lot of countries are unilaterally recognizing products or fast-tracking products coming from this agency based on PAHO designation. And third, supporting the use of efficient resources by leverage the work of others. So there's been a lot of work that PAHO has done to enable this reliance and this trust building and people working together. But we've been doing this since 2009. The first regulatory authority that was evaluated was Chile. The last one that was evaluated last year was El Salvador. If you ask me, probably in 10 years, what we're doing, I hope to keep showing the same slide, because I think what has made us successful is that we improve over time, but that we have been consistent. We didn't shift because we thought it was not fashionable anymore. We have been doing this for 10 years, and you need 10 years to see results, and it has paid off. So we go in with a bunch of peers, with a better tool, and now since the global movement has push for a global harmonization. That's why we went to the global harmonizing tool, so we don't have PAHO one and the rest of the world another one, which we are always criticized for that, but we're aligning. So we have, and we work very hard with Mike's teams to do that. Once we have that tool, what do we use it for? To develop an institutional development plan. So it's basically we prioritize. We set clear goals based on gap analysis and context, and the context is a very important word. We don't always, let me explain. We go in and the first country, a clear examples, they will say, I need a new, I need to improve my biosimilar registration. And then you look in and they don't have lot release for vaccines. Or so we prioritize, maybe we want to start, or you import 99% of your medicines and you don't have a good distribution practice and good warehousing practice in place, and you don't have inspections for that. So we try to match the will with the real needs of the health system. Of course, the country is sovereign. They decide, but we try to guide based on real world priorities. But mostly, we pay attention to principal cross-cutting elements and function, and I will detail this in a minute. We provide technical support, but we try to stay away from workshops. I call them the parachuting workshops, because you go in, you parachute into the country, you give this magnificent workshop. Someone is smiling, then Google, I know you have this going on. You leave, you feel accomplished, and then a year later, that person has gone to the industry, you attain nothing, you spend a bunch of money, and it's not sustainable. So having said that, we do try to improve some level of training based on real-world experience, but mostly we try to match multilateral countries peer-to-peer. So we actually use an agency that is really good at quality assurance system. We bring those regulators to the other regulatory authority. We match them, we marry them, and says, learn from who is doing it on the ground. We use a lot of the NRAs of reference to do that, and that's their commitment for us to give them their badge, and they have been wonderful at that. We work through networks of different specialties or PANDRA for certainly, but for example, we have a network for falsified products, a network for pharmacovigilance. We are peer-to-peer networks, and they actually sustain and inform and share the work. And we provide, in some cases, and in many cases, direct technical cooperation. In the end, we try with that to improve the functionality of this regulatory system. So what do I mean by cross-cutting and principles and the essential regulatory functions? We developed this a while ago, just as a graph for a document we have on pharmaceutical policies. For the chapter on regulation. But if you look, we detail the principle and cross-cutting elements that were supported of the regulatory functions. More and more, when we go to evaluate, we focus on the principles and the cross-cutting elements being there, because we now empirically see that if you don't have those elements present, it's impossible to improve your functionality over time. It's if you don't have your legal systems, if you have your standards, if you don't have appropriate financial and human resources, if you don't have a quality assurance system, a competent human resources and the information system, it's very hard over time to change what you're doing. Mostly, there's a few intangibles. If you don't have the political will to change and to improve, and that means if you don't have your government decision to improve, it's a no-go. So we usually have a high-level meeting before we start cooperation and really it's a closed meeting, and we put, the cards on the table and says, how far are you willing to go? You're going to disrupt some of the local industry. You're going to disrupt some of the players. Are you willing to go with it? And when country says yes, and they have a sincere yes, and they want to go, they really improve very fast. And another intangible is usually the buy-in from the local industry has been a key determinant. And it's not a conflict of interest. A lot of the local industry are realizing that if they do that and they have better trust of the regulatory authority, they improve the trust of their products abroad, and they start exporting more, even to the sub-region. And actually, whatever they need to invest, they recover many times. So those are the things we measure, which we cannot put in any tool, but it goes before we start measuring the standardized part. So in 2015, just with very few indicators, the very basic one, we measure by sub-region where we were. And as you can see, the two sub-regions that were not doing greatly was Central America and the CARICOM, the Caribbean non-Latin countries. So mostly English and one French-speaking countries. I'm not going to go into that today, but I hope the committee at one point learns what the Caribbean has been doing to address this, which is the Caribbean regulatory system. It's a centralized system. My colleague Charlie Preston at one point might, brief you on that, because I think it's worth knowing. But let me go a little bit into what happened in Central America and some of the things that we're doing. Before we go that panorama translates into that 82% of the population in the Americas is covered with the NRA of reference. That's great news. It's a big percentage. So, functional, well-developed regulatory authority. But if you look at countries, 14 out of 35 countries have some or no legal basis of organizational structure for regulatory systems. So in terms of member state, that's a worrisome number. Even more challenging if you count the territories, which are tiny in the Caribbean. So you might think that 2% of the population having no legal basis for organizational structure is not that worrisome, but that's equivalent to 18 million people in our region, and that's not right. So we need to do something. When you have small countries and small population having absolutely no regulatory authority whatsoever, having no control of the markets whatsoever, that actually brings us to reconsider the kind of approach we were doing. So if you look at this, we started to look at what are the correlations in the country settings, and I'm not going to go deeply into this because, again, this is another chapter of what we do that are small state. But some of these intangibles, what are other things rather than functions or history that correlates with your regulatory capacity? If you look at these 4 levels, the most developed to the least developed, they tend to correlate with the number of people, the population in the countries, meaning very small markets with very small, tend to have very small capacities. They don't attract good companies. They don't have the number of human resources to, sometimes they have one pharmacy in an island, and the pharmacist is not in the government, so they can really not hope with regulation. Another thing it correlates, it's with the absolute GDP, not the GDP per person, just the absolute GDP in that country. So it can be a high-income country, but very small. But if the economy is very small, the kind of regulatory system that creates the kind of market is not a good market for quality assurance and for having high stringency of regulation. Based on that, we are developing a whole line of cooperation for small states and how to address it. But what we started looking at what are the organizational structure, the financing system, and in a way how those finances are set for the evaluation of current organizational structure and finances in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me refer to the first one, which is what happens depends on what is the hierarchy of the regulatory authority within the health system. So what we have found, and it's a correlation, which it's just that for now, it's a correlation, but it's quite strong, that all the regulatory authorities that tend to be very developed have a high level of independence from the Ministry of Health or another authority. So they either an independent agency, they have certain level of administrative independency, they have their own budget, and the level of the director or coordinator is quite high in the hierarchy of the health system. It's not 5 levels below the Ministry of Health in the basement, and we've seen that. I'm saying the basement because that's what sometimes they put the regulators in many ministries of health. Yes, they do. And then if you look at the next level, the authorities that are between what we call a level 3, 2 or 3, which is similar to what now we are shifting into maturity level, you see a few that have quite independent, and actually you don't know that, but those in green that are, they are a high level 3, according to our evaluations, and the ones, the more they go towards a level 2, they have less independence from the Ministry of Health. And all the way down to having almost no legal or independence or legal structure to do what they have to do or to have any enforcement power, and sometimes it reduces to one person within the procurement agency doing quality assurance. It's countries that have no regulatory system structure again. So I'm really glad Miquel is here because he experienced part of our technical cooperation during the years he was in COFEPRIS. And when a regulatory authority comes to PAHO to improve, what the first thing that we do is says it's a management issue, it's a structure issue, and it's a hierarchy issue. You need to empower your regulatory authority within the health system. You have to empower your people, and you have to rethink your management before starting looking at the different functions. And in terms of financing, there's also a correlation, although this is an ongoing study, that most of the regulatory authorities still in our countries are dependent on the budget of the Ministry of Health. In most cases, the revenue comes from fee of service that goes to the national treasury, and then just only some of that money come back. There's really not a good rationale in most countries to how they fund their fees and tariffs. Some are ridiculously low, even for the market size, yeah, especially in some of the most poor subregions. So it really, it's hard to think how they were at least finance their own work. And we are conducting right now a thorough assessment of the fees and structures normalized by market and by population to help member states evaluate the current approach to pricing. We think that there's a lot to do in this and better to improve it. But let me give you an example now back to Central America. This was a few years back when already the last authority that's there is El Salvador, which is the one was doing very well, but it's 4 years after they recreated, and I'm going to tell you the story. But as you can see, it's one of the regions that has the least capacities. Each of those represent a country, and that was the average of all the countries. Actually, so El Salvador lifted the average for most of the sub-region. So when El Salvador decided to do a health system reform, one of the key elements was to create a new agency. They closed the regulatory authority they had within the Ministry of Health, and they created a separate agency dependent on the president of the country, and it gave it administrative, institutional, and technical independence. It had power for regulatory oversight and enforcement, which is a key issue that most authorities in some of the small countries didn't have. And for the development, they decided to go through a risk-based approach on strategic planning. And what they did, they took the tool that we were using and actually used it for creating a institutional development plan. Some of the data of the result, when they started, they have, today they have 32 manufacturers that comply with GMP 32, certainly not the latest one, but quite a strong one. 6 years ago, there were only 2 in the country. And the pharma industry comply by investing $70 million in their manufacturer, but today that had increased their exports by 20%. So today, El Salvador industry is a leading exporter to especially the sub-region of quality assured medicine. Someone was asking about the incentives. I think the incentives are economical. I do agree, unfortunately, that most of the times the health and quality by itself, it's not enough, at least. It's part of it, but there's a lot to do in partnering with the idea that the local pharma that will survive, because a lot close, would be the strongest one, but will have the benefits of having access to a better market. So what did they do? They concentrated on the cross-cutting elements, and basically the CSSP was how it called before. They closed it. Basically, they literally closed it and created the DNA. It went from being an agency created by a ministerial decree to a president with a law, with powers, and by presidential designation, so legal framework. The human resources in the agencies and the authorities before were basically a few pharmacists and administrative. They went back to an HR plan, which they hire based on a diverse set of competencies. They have legal, physicians, everybody that they need, and each person had a folder, and it still does, an actual folder with a competence in development individualized for that person once they are in the agency. I think regulators are mostly like researcher. I was a researcher, a physician by training. If you ask me how do you train a researcher, it's in the lab. You put them, that's how you train during your doctorate. You have to take some courses, but mostly you learn by doing. And I think that's a little bit of the approach that the DNM have been using, and using other agencies that they send people to be trained and then they get them back. The budget comes from the Treasury in the previous iteration. In this one, they return the monies from the fees. And not only they are sustainable, but they tend to save they actually have savings every year, well above $1 million a year, which is a huge amount for El Salvador. Before they have no quality management system, one of the first things we helped them do was establishing a QMS. Actually, Mikel, during his tenure, and Cofrepris did a lot helping El Salvador training. They were the closest NRAs of reference there, so I think he can tell you more about that. They created 23 technical and administrative units with 240 employees, all very young, that had been developed during the years, 6 years in there. And they gave them sustainability, better salaries than the rest of the administration, and competitive salaries compared to the industry, and especially stability. So a lot of the people stay, and they give them benefits, especially to women. So they tend to retain a lot of the personnel. And lastly, they have one of the most amazing software developers in-house who has developed the whole software that they use. So it's sustainable because it's free, they don't put royalties. And they actually even can have all the information, even for pricing and for georeferences, everything, all the manufacturers and even the pharmacies they have in the country. So although they improved their processes, of course, and they did it well, they put a lot of effort and a lot of money on those cross-cutting elements and on their finances. And we think that that was the big difference for other agencies. And now a lot of other agencies of small countries are learning from that and are following their pathway. So I'm going to stop there. I think it's just a little bit of oversight what we've been doing. But just to finish, we are convinced that what these authorities had been doing over the years had been benefit from a very standardized approach, using a standardized tools that we have improved over the years. We have published the results that are available fully for other regulatory authorities. So regulatory authorities can see. We don't put all the indicators for the public, we put the basic and the level, because there is some sensitive information for pharma and we don't want to clean it out. We will have to think very detailed, very well if we can publish the level of granularity. But if you are an authority that has been evaluated, you have full access to the indicators of other authorities that we put it. We think there is a business case. Every time we go and an authority has improved, we've seen in Mexico, you improve exports, you decrease prices when generic competition. The same is happening in Chile. We have seen that in Salvador. So the business case for regulatory system strengthening, I think it's very clear. And last but not least, we think in order to have an improvement in the regulatory system, the regulatory authority and the system has to be prestigious within the health system, has to occupy a level of importance of certain authority within the health system, and it cannot be buried under the third level of the Ministry of Health because it's very hard to actually get the work done. So I'm going to stop there and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Porras. And let's start with some questions on this side. Julie?
I'm Julie Kaswell from University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm just wondering if, as I understand it, you're adopting the WHO's framework for ranking countries or ranking regulatory agencies. I was wondering if there's some resistance to doing that, and because you've had a well-developed system and now you're moving to another system.
Great question. No, actually, we had a mandate from member states around the world that we have to harmonize to one system. So we have a resolution, the 2010, and that's we are not moving back. So that system will, still the regional system will prevail. And what you're seeing by the WHO system is actually work that we done, our countries have done with the countries at the global level, and PAHO has been working with WHO on that. And I think I'm fair to say, Mike, a lot of what's in that tool is the same system. I think there's a little bit of resistance on the grandfathering, not grandfathering our NRAs of reference. So our countries are looking for the policy that WHO is going to have at the global level to see how they adapt and move into that, because they believe there's a lot of work they put on that. But for example, the fact sheets, the way we test it, that's based on our system. So I think it's for us is a common, and we are looking forward to having one system because we believe the countries in the region can withstand a global benchmarking and not just a regional one. And so we look forward to moving that. It's growing pains.
Thank you. Prashant, why don't we take you next?
Thanks very much. Two quick questions. One is about, you had a slide on the user fee, and you said in most countries it goes back to Treasury versus the agency having full independence and keeping it. Are there examples of countries in the region where it doesn't go to the Treasury and the agency gets to ring fence that money? That's the first question. The second is similar to what we have here in the United States, which is the GDUFA and the PDUFA came with some performance requirements and specific timeline performance goals. So are there similar performance goals that agencies which didn't have user fee and initiated user fee had to negotiate, or the user fees came without a GDUFA-like performance goal? Thank you.
The latest example of Salvador, it doesn't go back to Treasury. So they retain every single penny, and they administer it. Some are mixed system. Brazil has a mixed system. The fees or the tariff are not in performance. That's, you pay for a registration. Likewise, you do outside PDUFA and GDUFA. You pay for something. What you added with GDUFA was improved performance, and if I'm, just to. So we don't have, I don't believe we have some of those systems. That's part of what we're trying to see, if we can actually look at different ways that we can improve performance in system. The tariff, the fees are so low that even some people from pharma on confidence out of it says, like, you can't expect them to perform if they are charging $50, $100 for a registration. So that seems very low. But for now, it's just, we don't have all the elements to have a evidence-based recommendation of what they should do with the fees.
I'm going to take one last question on this round from Veronica, who had her flag up right at the beginning, and then we're going to move on to the next speaker.
Veronica Wirtz, Boston University. Analia, thank you very much for the great presentation. I was very intrigued by the comment you made about working with industry, and I think that regulatory authority working with industry, and I know that raises a lot of red flags for some agencies, particularly in other regions. Is there kind of like a guide for good practice, how this interaction should be handled? What are, let's say, good practices, etc.? Or do you have, let's say, a case study which could illustrate how that has been beneficial? I'm thinking particularly now on this report and the remarks in a previous report that working with industry something is for some regulatory authorities really a rethinking, and a good practice guide or case study could perhaps help. Thank you.
To be honest with you, I think regulatory authorities around the world, especially the most developed one, have a very well-oiled mechanism of how they work with industries. So I think it's just a matter of emulating that at a different level. So nobody blinks if FDA or EMA has a committee to discuss, any kind of the regulatory process. It's well regulated. It has conflict of interest provisions. So that's one level. But I think it's a recognition that at any regulatory environment outside medicines, there's a regulator and there's a regulated sector. And they need to not work confounded or just mixed together, but they have to understand that they have to move in the same direction. What we've seen is not working together in terms of sitting and deciding the regulations together. So that was separate. But in terms of the national understanding at the high level that there's going to be a need for the industry to improve their performance in quality assurance and invest, and that the regulators would actually be more stringent with it, but then the trust would benefit the industry to export. And that some people are going to be left behind, and those are the industries which are unable to comply. I don't think that's done in a closed room around the table. Actually, that's done at the government level, high-level conversations, and then everybody works on their separate environment. It's not a very specific question, but that's what we've seen working. And I think in the next panel, when Mikel can touch upon that, because I think that's one of the examples we've seen in Brazil, we've seen in Mexico, and we've seen in El Salvador.
Great. Analia, are you able to stay with us through the next panel discussion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So committee members, hold on to those questions. We may be able to work them in the next section. Thank you.